First of all, I want to thank the Maine Arts Commission for allowing me to hang my work in this space. It's really an honor and a privilege to have my work here where so many people can see it. And I especially want to thank Martha for all the hard work that she's done in organizing not only the show but also this event today. And she's just been a joy to work with, so thank you for everything. And secondly, I want to thank you for being here, for coming down to hear me ramble about my work. People make art for a lot of different reasons. I do it because I want to connect with people. You know, it's very easy for us to feel like we're alone in the universe. You know that saying, we're born alone, we die alone. And in between, we can connect with people. And art is a way, and it's always been this way for me, even since I was a child. When I first saw work that moved me, I felt like the artist understood the way I saw the world. And I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to make art that was a manifestation of my own experience here in this life, but also that connected with other people, so that when they saw my work, they felt like they weren't alone in the universe in some way. So thank you for looking at my work and for coming here to hear me talk. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I've come to the point where I am now with my work. One of the things that I look for in a great work of art, probably the only thing that I look for really, is authenticity. I'm always moved by a work that I feel is an authentic representation of the artists themselves. And that's really difficult to do because, first of all, if you want to be an artist, you have to learn fluency in the language of visual form, because that's what we do. We communicate with visual language, lines, shapes, colors, and that language has its own set of rules, and just like English does, or any verbal language, and you have to learn that language. You also have to learn technique, which requires countless hours of practice. Whatever medium you're working in, you have to learn how to become the master of your materials and of your tools. But once you've done all that, if you've managed to do all that, because that can take tens of thousands of hours, what are you going to do with that? And I think, this is my own personal belief, and I know this is subjective, but if you want to make great art, you have to take those skills and that language and find a way to manifest your own individuality through your work without copying other people, which is difficult because you may have spent years copying the masters. That's how you learned. And then you have to unlearn all that and try to find a way to figure out who you are and to manifest that into the work, and that's what I try to do. So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. 20 years ago, I was living in Massachusetts, and as Martha said, I was working full-time in a corporate environment as a one-person art department doing graphic design, art direction, photography, illustration, copywriting, and anything else they wanted me to do. And I was going home at night and spending time with my kids, and once they were in bed, I had a room in the house that was my art studio, and I would paint, sometimes until it was time to go to work the next morning. I had gotten away from art after graduate school to play music, and that's important because it really informed the type of artist that I've become. I was in graduate school studying printmaking, and I really didn't want to be a printmaker. I wanted to be a painter, but when I was an undergrad, my advisor told me that my drawings and my prints were much better than my paintings, and that I should apply to grad school as a printmaker. And she said to me something that I'll never forget, and it really had a huge impact on my life. She said, "Frank, here's the thing. When it comes to color, some people just get it, and some people don't. And you're one of the ones that doesn't get it. But that's okay, because you can still be an artist and work in black and white." And as painful as that was, she was right. I didn't get it. I wanted to get it. You know, I felt like I could get it someday, but she was right. I didn't get it, you know, and my paintings were not very good. And so I applied as a printmaker, and it wasn't a great experience for me because when I went to grad school, the printmaking professor was on maternity leave and they didn't hire a replacement. I was the only graduate student that was a printmaker. There were 2 sculptors, everyone else was a painter, and they had their own building that I wasn't allowed in. All the painters had studios, and I had free access to the print shop, but there were no other printmakers, there were no printmaking classes. So I left to pursue a career in music because I just felt that that was the direction that my life wanted me to go in. So I moved back to Massachusetts from Washington, D.C., and formed a band, and I did that for about 10 years. And playing music that was very it was improvisational rock music, really. I played guitar, and the bands that I had played instrumental music. There was no singing, and most of it was a lot of improvisation, which is important because that really informed what I ended up becoming as a painter. So I developed an injury in my right hand from just playing the guitar for 8 hours a day, and I had to stop playing. And so,
Frank, sorry to interrupt. I think you wanted these to be moving.
Yeah, sorry. There we go. That should work now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I went through a period of despair and depression, and I felt like I had trusted my instincts to follow the path that I was on, and the universe betrayed me. Little did I know that was exactly what I was supposed to do. But so I went back to school, studied graphic design and illustration, and got a job in a corporate environment, and I just kind of gave up on, being creative, or I tried to anyway. But I had all this free time on my hands because I couldn't play the guitar anymore. And I was back in art school, so I was learning about color, among other things. So once I finished school and started working, I just became consumed with becoming a painter. I wanted to be a great painter, and so I was working during the day and coming home at night, and after my kids were in bed, I would be in my art studio just painting and painting and painting and trying to figure out color, copying paintings by the masters, making really terrible paintings from landscapes around my house, and learning through the process. And then at one point, a friend of mine went to see a speaker, and the guy talked about, it was all about managing your time and setting goals. And he had an audio CD program that my friend bought, and he made me a copy of it. It was really good. And one of the things that I heard on that CD was the speakers, he said, ask yourself a couple of questions to try to help figure out what your goals are. And one of them was, and he said, just write the first thing down that comes into your head. Don't think about it. And he said, what would you do if you suddenly had $1 million? And I wrote down in my sketchbook, I'd quit my job, and I'd move up to Maine and just paint. And then the other question was, what would you do if you found out you only had a year to live? And I said, I'd quit my job, and I'd move to Maine. I'd live in an old farmhouse and have like a barn with a studio in it, and I would paint there. And then he said, write that down on a piece of paper and put it somewhere where you can see it every day to remind yourself that's your goal, that's your dream. Because you never know when an opportunity is going to present itself to help you reach that goal. So I did. I wrote it on a piece of paper, and I hung it up in the room that was my art studio, right over my drafting table. And one night my wife came up there. This was almost 20 years ago. She came up to use the computer that was in that room. She was buying clothes for the kids on eBay, and she saw this ad that said, check out the new eBay real estate. So she clicked on it, and she typed Maine farmhouse. And this ad came up, and she called me over. I was at my easel painting, and she said, come here, look at this. And there was this old farmhouse, the little barn next to it. And I looked over at the piece of paper on the wall, and I said, that's weird. That looks just like my dream. So here we are in Maine. So we came up here, and I decided, we had 2 young children at the time. My son was a year and a half old. My daughter was just turned 5. And we decided that I would stay home with the kids during the day because I really wanted to spend time with them. And my wife wanted to work. So I said, you fine, you work. I'll stay home with the kids. And then when they were in school or they were in bed, I was painting. And I started going out every day, even in the winter, brutally cold, horrific winters that we have. I would be outside every day with my pastels and my paints and just drawing and painting and making, not very good drawings and paintings, but I did it every day, and they got better and better over time. And so I continued to do that, and here we are 20 years later. So that's how I got here. And I want to talk now a little bit about the things that I learned during that process and how my work has evolved. I didn't know what kind of paintings I wanted to make. I knew that there was something inside of me that was trying to get out, and I felt like that was the purpose in my life, was to make those paintings. And I felt like I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do that. But I didn't know what those paintings were going to look like. And I looked at the work of the artists that I admired, but they were all so different. And I struggled to reconcile that. How do you reconcile, my love of Rembrandt with my love of de Kooning? Because If you look at them side by side, you think they have, other than it being paint, they have nothing in common. But there's some common denominator there because I love both of them. And the two British painters, Turner and Constable, were two artists that really had a profound impact on me. Here were two painters from the same country, born the same year, about 50 miles away from each other. Their favorite painter was the French painter Claude Lorraine. Both of them worshiped Claude Lorraine. They were born in the same year, they lived near each other, and their paintings couldn't be more different. And I loved them both. I would look at Constable paintings and think, oh, I want to paint like that. And I'd see the Turner and think, oh, I want to paint like that. And I couldn't do one or the other because they were so different from one another. So through the process of making literally hundreds and hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings, I started to figure out what were the things that were important to me and to try to strip away all the things that weren't me and to find out what was me. And what I realized was that one of the things that art can do, painting in particular, it's a visual medium. We experience it through our eyes. And a lot of artists only focus on that element. They look at the subject and the goal is to make the painting or the drawing or the etching or the photograph or whatever it is look like the subject, so that when the viewer looks at the work, they see the subject, what it looked like. But I realized, and this came from listening to music, especially a lot of instrumental music, and how it moved me emotionally, and how I would hear a piece of music and it would conjure up memories from my childhood, or it would make me feel emotions. I thought, painting can do that too. And so what I started to figure out was what I wanted to do with my paintings was to make a painting that didn't look like something, but that was a visual manifestation of all that other stuff, non-visual stuff, emotions, feelings, things like that. And so, as I developed the ability to make drawings and paintings that looked like my subjects, I found myself becoming increasingly dissatisfied with my work. And what was happening was people would see my paintings and they would recognize the places, specific places. I know where that is. That's the old Henderson barn. I used to, lug potatoes in there when I was a kid or whatever. And it dawned on me that I didn't want people to have a specific experience like that. I wanted it to be more general. So I started taking the buildings out of my paintings, and then I started working more from my imagination and my memory. I'd gone outside almost every day for 12 years and drawing and painting from direct observation. And so I built up this vocabulary of forms, shapes of trees and fields and orientations of the ground plane and the sky and these dense environments of stuff that you couldn't penetrate. I'd spent all this time drawing and painting those things, and I had amassed this vocabulary, and so I thought, well, why don't I take that and work from that? So I still go outside and draw just to keep my skills up, but I don't do it with the intent of making, finding a subject for a painting. I paint from my imagination. And what I try to do now is to make paintings that represent my own personal feelings, really. And one of the things that happened when I moved here to northern Maine, it's very rural. The town I live in has a population of about 600 people. The city I grew up in Massachusetts has a population that's probably more than the entire state of Maine. One of the things that happened was when I was a child, my parents bought a house in this new development. They were still building the houses, and it was enclosed. You could get into the neighborhood, and there were several streets with houses, but you could only get out the way you came in. And the neighborhood was surrounded by woods that had been farms at one time. I learned this later on because my friends and I would go out into the woods, and we could never understand why they had these rock walls running through the woods. Like, who did this? What does this mean? Who stacked all these rocks in a line, in the middle of the woods? Well, apparently those used to be fields. But I would wander around these woods, and there were paths and old farm roads and things as a kid, mostly by myself. I would just wander around and have this experience that, well, it's difficult to put into words. That's why I'm a painter. But I was taking in the visual this mysterious world of nature, but also the sounds, the weather, the time of year, the insects, the wind, sounds you hear in the distance. Like I was taking all that stuff in, and it just seemed magical to me. And then I moved to, of course, all that woods got bought up by developers, and it's all big houses now. But I moved to Maine, and I found myself in that same environment, only on a much bigger scale. But I'm an adult now, so it kind of works, And here I could throw my backpack full of pastels over my shoulders and take my drawing board and walk half a mile from my house, and I'm back into that world that I lived in when I was a child, walking around. And so I want my paintings in a lot of ways to just be that experience, to take that magical experience that I remember from childhood of being out in the woods and just wandering around and wondering, like, what used to be here? What does this mean? Like sensing that I was in this kind of magical place. And I want that to be in my paintings, so that when people look at my paintings, those that, I have kindred spirit with me anyway, will recognize that. And as Martha said, that's the greatest compliment I get, is when people look at a painting that I did from my imagination, and they say, I know where that is. Because I know that feeling. And I love that, That's really what I strive for. And some of the ways that I do that, like I said, you have to learn the language of visual form, and you have to learn how to use your tools as a way to manifest whatever your artistic vision is. And so in terms of conveying those emotions, music was really important to me because, I love music, I played music, I studied music, and looking back on the way my life kind of meandered and ended up, I probably learned more about painting from playing music than I did in art school. Because things like composition, the structure of a piece of music, how's it organized, that's really important to painting. And in terms of color, I think in terms of harmony, just like music is, And it's interesting that we have a 12-step color wheel. In the music, they have the circle of fifths, which is 12 keys in a circle, and the opposites are across from each other. It's the same idea, and I love that. And so one of the things I do with my paintings is I think about, what key is this painting in? Is it B minor, or is it C sharp major, or whatever? And I kind of think of those tonalities as colors. Certain keys are warm, certain ones are cool, some are really cold, some are really hot. I think about transitions, so that's really important. And then things like tempo, when I'm painting, there are times when certain marks that I make are made very slowly, these long, gradual, kind of like a long note in a piece of music, and there are other times where it's very rapid, and I'm working very fast. And I think that way when I'm painting. And another thing that happened that's worth mentioning about just my technique, if you look at my paintings, this, especially if you didn't know this already, it might become more apparent when you look at them. But I started painting with a palette knife about 2 years after I moved to Maine. What had happened was I was working on a painting in my studio, and I was painting with brushes. I did a lot of exercises, learning how to master the brush. And then right before I moved to Maine, I went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and I saw this big display of John Singer Sargent paintings. And I think you almost have to be a brush painter to appreciate this. But I saw those paintings, and I thought, what's the point of painting with a brush? I remember this one in particular. It was a figure of a woman, and she had this dress on with this kind of, like that kind of sheer material like they make wedding dresses out of. And I looked at her arm, and there was this sleeve of this, this really beautiful, intricate material. And I looked at it, and it was just a brushstroke. And I could see what he did. He loaded up the brush with white paint, and he hit the canvas with it, and he yanked it down. But as he did it, he changed the pressure, and he rotated the brush this way and that, and he angled it, all in a split second. And it was such a display of virtuosity, I felt like I could spend my whole life trying to learn to paint with a brush and not be that good. And then what's the point? Because it's already been done, So I started getting frustrated with painting with brushes. And then one day I was mixing paint with a palette knife, and I wanted to see how the color worked in the painting, because the color on the palette and the color in the painting are never the same, because all of the colors in the painting affect one another. You know, you can have orange on the palette and you put it in the painting and it's brown. And you think, wait a minute, that's orange, that's brown, and it changes. Or it could go the other way around. It could be brown on the palette and orange in the painting. So I picked up some paint just to test it, and I put it on the surface of the canvas, and I liked the way that looked, just putting the paint down with the knife. So what I started doing was doing these brush paintings, and then at the end I would add some texture. And then after I moved to Maine, I was here probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years, I went down to Boston to see a Edward Hopper show at the Museum of Fine Arts. He was one of my heroes. I loved Edward Hopper. Copied a lot of his paintings, studied him extensively. And, but I went through the show, and I was really kind of disappointed in the way the paintings, like his compositions are brilliant, and his color and his values and everything else was brilliant, but I was disappointed in the surfaces. They just looked like painting, you know? And you could see like where maybe he used a straight edge or a tape to get a straight line, and it just seemed overworked to me. And then so when you leave the show, they have the gift shop where you can get the Edward Hopper catalog and the coffee mug and the necktie and all that stuff. And then on the other side was the Impressionist room. And so I went through the gift shop, and I bought the coffee mug and the necktie and the catalog. And then I went into the Impressionist room, and I saw the Monets and the Van Goghs where the paint was thick on the canvas. And I had this, you know, it was the juxtaposition of the two in that short period. I just went, okay, this is what I want. I want paint like this on the surface. So I went home, put my brushes away, which was great because I didn't have to clean them anymore. And I started painting with a knife. But you know, one of the things I had learned about with painting with brushes is how important the brushstroke is. And this is something, you know, I know all my students struggle with this, just understanding how you articulate the mark with the brush is such an important thing, and you really have to learn how to do that. And I'd studied it. I'd done a lot of exercises and practiced, you know, turning the brush the right way, and how much pressure you apply, and how much paint you pick up, and what type of brush you use, and all of that stuff is very important. And I was very particular about the marks that I made. And so when I started painting with the knife, it was the same thing. I knew the mark that I wanted, but I'm right-handed, and it was awkward. Sometimes I couldn't get what I wanted on the canvas because I'm right. So I was always turning the canvas. You know, I'd have to turn it this way to get the mark, and then I'd turn it back, or I'd flip it upside down and do this, and then turn it back. And that was a lot of work. And I would complain to people, and people would say, like, well, why don't you get an easel that rotates? And I thought, yeah, but that's kind of silly, you know, and I don't want it spinning around on me, you know. And one day I was working on a painting. I remember the painting, and it wasn't very big. It was maybe a 18 by 24, and I just got frustrated with turning the painting, and so I took it off the easel and I put it on the table. And then just like the lights came on. You know, it was like in the Wizard of Oz when it turns to color from black and white, you know. All of a sudden I'm like, oh, this. So now I could walk around the table and paint any way I wanted to, and I could hold the canvas with my left hand and turn, so I could get marks that I couldn't do on the easel, because I could hold the knife and the canvas and work them together. And what I also found that I loved was that the canvas has a little bit of a bounce to it. So there became this element of how much pressure I applied. And I do a lot of pastel drawings. I've always done pastel drawings. And I'm very aware when I'm doing pastels of when I smudge the pastel, or even when I'm drawing with the pastel on the paper, like how much pressure I apply. You know, like it's very important, you know, just a little bit or a lot, or sometimes, you know, it's technique, right? Sensitivity, just like a musician, you know, will do the same thing. How they articulate the notes as how much pressure I apply. And so now I had this thing where the canvas would bounce, and it became part of my process, which I love. So I started painting on tables. This would have been, you know, 15 years ago, maybe more. So that's what I do now. I paint on a table. And all my canvases are done that way. I work on the table and I walk around the table. And because I work on the paintings from all four sides, it helps me to be aware of, you know, how all the marks that I make engage with the edge of the frame, you know, without having to, you're always looking at it from the same way. Because if you put your canvas on an easel and you're looking at it all in the same orientation all the time, you don't really get a sense of that, you know. But I'm always thinking about how the marks come to the edge. And that was something that Jackson Pollock, I know, was an artist that was very much aware of, like how the marks engage with the frame of the edge of the image, you know. And then and I watched a documentary on him, and he was painting on a floor in a potato barn. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's good. Me and Jackson were like, you know. So I think that's probably all I had to say, unless you want me to talk more. But we said maybe half an hour, right? Does anybody have any questions?
Do you still listen to music when you're painting?
I do, yes. It varies, but I like to listen to music when I paint. The main reason is it stops me from thinking, you know, because I don't want to think when I paint. This is something that I should have mentioned, but your question leads me to this, so it's important, is when I was learning about color, and I really struggled with it. I spent a lot of time studying color. I was working with pastels, and one of the things I decided to do was to just kind of strip everything back. So what I would do is I would begin a drawing with one color. I would draw the whole composition out in one color. Usually it was like a yellow ochre or a warm gray or a cool gray, a kind of a dull color, not too dark. And I would sketch out the whole composition in one color. And then I would take that color and put it in my left hand. Then I would get another color that would react to the first one, maybe a darker color. If the first color was warm, maybe a cool color. And I would go in and work the whole drawing with that. And then that would go into my hand. And I'd pick another color out of the box. And I worked the whole picture all at once, rather than drawing specific elements of the composition. I would work the whole picture. And I would only add a color if I felt the picture needed it. So as I began to do that, I'd end up with 12 or 15 sticks in my left hand. And those became the colors for that drawing. And every drawing was different. And so it occurred to me, I should paint like that, you know, because it made sense. So what I started doing was mixing my colors for the painting before I start to paint. And so I mix up a palette of colors, and it kind of starts the same way. I start with one color, and then another one, and then another one. And I think of them like characters in a story, like in a novel or in a play. And, you know, sometimes there's a main character, you know, like Hamlet, and everybody else is subordinate to Hamlet and what he did. And sometimes it's like a protagonist and an antagonist, you know, the good guy and the bad guy story. That might be orange and blue, you know, and maybe one triumphs over the other one, or maybe they both win or they both lose or whatever. Sometimes it's three colors. I learned that one time. I was working on a painting that was it was red, violet, and yellow, green, which are complements. And I just couldn't get it to work. And then I thought of one of my favorite movies, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the old Clint Eastwood Western, and how there's three characters. And they're all different and equal. And so I introduced this orange to the painting, and the whole thing came together. And I thought, okay, that's what it needed. It needed three main characters, right? Sometimes it's a love story. Two colors meet, they fall in love, they live happily ever after. So I mix all my colors. And that part of the process is physics, you know, like looking at the color and realizing, okay, it's too pink, how do I make it less pink? Or it's too dark, how do I make it lighter? It's too light, it's whatever. These two colors are too similar, how do I make them different? These two colors are too different, how do I make them similar? That's all science and physics, and is it left brain? Let's forget that. I think it's left brain stuff. And so I like keeping that separate from the act of painting, which is 100% intuitive. I just get in there and work. And so I don't want to be thinking at all when I'm painting. And the music helps with that. It just shuts my brain off so I can just focus on what I'm doing.
If you're listening to musical stuff, you're not listening to anything with lyrics.
Sometimes there's lyrics, but I don't listen to them. You know, I don't really pay attention to the music. It's just on, but it keeps my brain from getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. And I've found that because there's such an emotional component to my paintings, and somebody asked me about this, but this is how I realized it. Somebody asked me the question, and I thought about the answer, is once I start listening to a certain type of music, like a certain artist, if I'm working on a painting, I can't change the music. You know, I can't go from like Beethoven to Jethro Tull or the other way around. Whatever music it is, it has to stay that, you know. And sometimes I'll play the same song, I'll just put it on repeat and just play the same song over and over again. It just becomes this drone, you know, that sets the mood for the painting. And then interestingly, whenever I look at my paintings, and I can look at paintings from 20 years ago, and I remember what I was listening to, you know, when I was painting them. Because it's somehow that part of the emotion that I felt from the music is in the painting. It becomes part of the painting.
Do you ever find, I don't mean to be doing these questions, but do you ever find with that palette that you've created that at a certain point you need that other color? Like it reminds me of that Turner example, right? When J.M.W. Turner goes into the salon and he looks at his painting hanging on the wall and he takes the red and he plops it up because he needs that tiny little speck. Like, have you had the experience where you need to make a tiny little adjustment?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great question. So I'll mix all these colors, and sometimes there's 15 or 20 colors, and I use these, I think they're 12 by 18 disposable palette sheets. They come in pads, and I usually have 3, sometimes there's 4, and they've got little piles of paint, and they're sort of related, you know, maybe the cool colors and the warm colors, or the saturated colors and the desaturated colors, and I'll have these 3 or 4 pads of color, and then I'll start working on the painting, but once I start to work, the painting will tell me this color needs to change. And sometimes one of the colors that I made that I was thinking was going to be a main character in the story doesn't get used at all. I don't even use it. It's just I never use it. And then sometimes what happens, and I love this, I've got all my colors and I'm working on the painting, and then I get to the end and I just have this impulse, and this is one of the things I learned as an artist, is to trust my instincts. You know, this crazy idea pops into your head, that's the thing to do. Do it. You know, and it is safe because you know. I mean, you can't always do that in life, but in my studio I can. And I'll get this crazy idea. Yeah, I need a little bit of this really intense green right down here. And I'll go over and mix up the green and I'll put it in. And I don't even question like why. I just do it. And then I put that green in the painting and I get that. And it's done. That's perfect. And I love that. And every time I see the painting and I see that little thing that came at the end, you know, or sometimes it gets sprinkled all over the painting. This color that I didn't anticipate being part of the composition shows up at the end, you know, crashes the party, and all of a sudden makes it really fun for everybody. You know? Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
You started out by saying that a teacher told you you didn't get color. Lots of evidence that that's changed.
Yes.
Was that to do mostly with what you just called the physics of the material you're working with, or was that more an emotional or intuitive kind of thing?
It was a lot of it was science, physics, you know, understanding colors and understanding perception, because you know one of the things that I struggled with was understanding that the color something isn't necessarily the color that we see. You know, that wall back there was painted a particular color from Sherwin-Williams or whatever. Somebody picked out this bone ivory or whatever, and they painted the wall. But I'm standing here looking at it, and I see 15 different colors because of the lighting and the shading. And if we change the lights, if we turn the overhead lights off, those colors would change. If the sun came out, those colors would all change. And so the color that it is and the color that you see, or the colors that you see, are very different. So it was figuring that out, like, because when you start out as an artist, and I teach painting, so I know everybody else struggles with this. Students, you know, okay, I'm going to paint this chair, and they look at the chair and they say, well, it's dark green. So they give themselves a dark green and they paint the chair all the same color. But I look at that chair, I see 12 different colors right now. So, and the chairs at the back of the room are different colors than the ones here because the light has to pass through the atmosphere and it travels longer distances and it changes when it gets to my eyes. So figuring out that, like what's the color that I see, not the color that it is. And that's science, I had to figure that out. And then figuring out how to get the colors that I wanted, that I saw, you know. Mixing up the color that I see. You know, first you have to understand, okay, what colors am I seeing here? And then how do I make that color with the paints that I have? And that's just takes a long time. There's an artist named Brian Rutenberg who I was listening to one of his audiobooks on the way down here today, but he said something really profound in one of his YouTube videos. He said an artist is someone who will spend an hour mixing the color pink because it has to be exactly the right pink. And I just went, yes! I know exactly what that is because I've done that. I've spent over an hour mixing the color just to get it right. And one of the things I did to learn to develop that skill was, I did a lot of exercises. I made color wheels and I made color charts. Like I would take like two complementary colors, say orange and blue, and so I would make a grid that was 9 by 9 1-inch squares, 81 squares. And I put blue in the top left, orange in the top right, and then I would try to mix them together and make the color in the middle that was exactly neutral between the two. It was neither orange nor blue, and I paint that in the middle square. And then I mixed the color that was halfway between the neutral and the blue, and then halfway between the neutral and the orange, and then the steps in between. And then I would tint those colors with white equally and work my way down. So I had this grid at the end of 81 squares. And if you think that took like 40 hours to do, it did. And I did it with all the color combinations. And then another thing, and as I was doing that, I was figuring out how to mix colors, Now it's, and I don't want to brag, but I do, like I'll show off to my students sometimes, they'll be working on a painting and they would try to get the color or something, I'll just come over and there, it's that, how'd you do that? Well, it's 10,000 hours of, and another thing I used to do was, I'd go to the Sherwin-Williams store in Holton and they had those swatches, paint, and I'd pretend I was, doing a project at home, and I'd go in and I'd grab a bunch of those swatches and I bring them home to my studio. And I had the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and white. And the exercise was match the swatch using those three colors. And sometimes that would take me an hour, and I wouldn't give up. I was just, no, it's going to be exactly the color that I'm looking at, and that's what I did. And I spent literally tens of thousands of hours doing that. So much time, and that's how I learned it. And now, 20 years later, when I look at colors and I see them. I know exactly what they are, and I know how to make them. If you give me a set of paints, I can whip up whatever color I see, right? But that wasn't a gift. It's not a talent. It's a skill that I acquired with a lot of hard work and perseverance. And my teacher saying that to me, that was the impetus for me determining to, I'm going to figure this out. No, I will not accept that. Okay, you're right. I don't get it, but I'm going to get it. Because I need to get it, so I just persevere. And then once you have the technique, once you have the ability to look at colors and know exactly what they are, and know how to make them with your paints, right? Once you have that, that's like, let's say you were a writer, right? You learn you learn every word in the Oxford English Dictionary, what they mean, every part of speech, every literary device there is, and you become a master of language. Then you can become a poet, right? You can use that to say whatever you want. And so then what I started to do was to think, okay, how can I use this knowledge and understanding of color that I've acquired to express myself rather than copying what I'm seeing? How can I use color to express feelings? And then that's a challenge, right? How do I translate this emotional thing into a color? And it's not just a single color, it's a combination of colors, because all of the colors in the painting work together. Like all the notes in a piece of music work together to create that feeling. Beethoven's trying to convey a certain emotion. It's not like he needs a certain note or a certain chord. He needs a lot of notes organized in a specific way to create that feeling. And so that's what I try to do. Thank you. Anybody else?
Do you have several paintings going at the same time?
No,
How does it
never.
work? Okay.
I can't do that.
Okay.
I can't do that. No, I'm committed. Once I start on a painting, I'm committed. And that's it. It just consumes my life.
How long does it take?
It depends, sometimes 3 hours, sometimes 3 years.
So that means in those 3 years you're not working on anything?
Well, in the 3-year paintings, I capitulate, I give up, and I just put it away, and I stop working on it, and then I do other things, and then I come back to it. You know? But generally, it's a week, 5 to 8 days, 2 or 3 days of color mixing. That's, you know, I'll go out to my studio for 4 hours or 5 hours and just mix colors and not finish, because I literally will spend sometimes an hour mixing a color. That happens a lot. And then once I have all the, and then I have to time it, you know, so that, you know, if I'm going out of town for 3 days, I don't want to mix all my colors and then go away and then come back and then dry it out.
I have a question about your coming to having a flat surface and being able to move around it. And at least most of the paintings that I have seen of yours have a horizon, at least one. And so I'm just curious about how you work, and I know you say these are all self-portraits, they're not a particular place or thing, but working around it 360, all the sides, yet you still maintain that
Yeah,
horizon line.
because I guess I'm a landscape painter. And I never set out to do that, but I never wanted to be a landscape painter, but I'd like to work outside, so there's that. I don't like to be around people when I'm working, so I'm not going to be doing portraits and figures, because, you know, I like to be alone when I work. So I'm not going to do people, because I've got to have the people there, and I don't want to do that. And I did 1 million still lifes in college, and I'm done with that. There was actually, when I was in graduate school, I had studied Giorgio Morandi against my will, and it's a funny story. Do we have time for this? I was taking a printmaking class in college with the teacher that told me I didn't understand color, and best teacher I ever had, Elizabeth P. Just a brilliant teacher, and I was taking this advanced printmaking class. I think it was printmaking 3 or something like that. In a couple of, maybe second or third class of the semester, at the end of class, she told us, you're going to have to do a research paper on an artist that made prints. Do a presentation at the end of the semester. So you have to write a paper about the artists and their work, and an analysis of their techniques and how they used, you know, visual form and what they did, and then you're going to have to give a slide presentation to the class. And I remember I was sitting on a table, and I was just like, okay, I'll write my Rembrandt paper tonight, because I knew everything there was to know about Rembrandt. I'd studied his etchings, and just, you know, he was my favorite artist, and he still is. And I was just sitting there all cocky thinking, yeah, I'm going to go home after dinner tonight, I'll just write my Rembrandt paper and I'll be done with it. I don't have to worry about it for the rest of the semester. I didn't say anything. I probably had a smirk on my face, but I didn't say anything. And all the other students were like, oh my God, we're going to write this paper. And so she dismissed the class, and I hopped down off the table, and I started to walk toward the door. She reached into her bag, and she pulled out this book. She pushed it into my stomach and knocked the wind out of me, and she said, "You're not doing Rembrandt." And so I looked down, and there's this book, and it said in big capital letters across the top, Morandi. And there was this picture of an old man with he had his glasses like this or something, you know. And I opened it up, and there were these really ugly, primitive drawings and paintings that looked like a child did them. I hated them. They were so ugly. I mean, Rembrandt was drama, you know, and pyrotechnics and amazing technique and amazing compositions, and the light and shade and the dramatic lighting and the action going on, and just, you know, Rembrandt. This was like these pictures of bottles and oil cans, and they were crooked and the lines weren't straight. And I was like, why are you doing this to me? And all I had was the book. There was no internet, you know. This was in the 80s. You couldn't go online and be like, you know, or now like this. My students now ask AI, write me a paper about Giorgio Morandi, and then they give it to me. And then I start asking them questions about it. They have no idea what they're talking about. All I had was the book. It was a catalog of a show. And I just looked at the pictures. I looked at the pictures. I looked at the pictures. I looked at the pictures. And the genius of Morandi emerged from the images, you know. And I realized that his pictures were about him. Like he reduced the subject matter to nothing to eliminate any kind of narrative or symbolism. And they were all about composition, color relationships, and the awkwardness to his lines was intentional because it gave the work humanity. And I realized that just from looking at the pictures. And I wrote the paper and got an A. and then I was just obsessed with still lifes. You know, so I started doing still, you know, and then when my whole portfolio to grad school was all still lifes. And I set up in my room, I put up this shelf on the wall, and I hung a sheet behind it, and I had all these bottles that I spray painted white, and I would organize them in different ways and make paintings of them. And I did dozens of paintings like that. It was just, you know, I thought this is what I'm going to do, still life painting. And then when I went to grad school, that's what I was doing, still life. So I never thought I'd become a landscape painter. But when I started painting again, I wanted to go outside, you know. And the thing I like about the landscape, well, I mean, if you want to learn about color and light, go outside because it's never wrong. The color is always right. It's always in harmony. And it's always different. Every day, every hour of the day, every day of the year, it's different. And it's always perfect. And I love that. You know. And I really love the idea of dealing with the concept of, you know, what we in art school we call plastic space, which is the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. You know, I love that. And when I was in school, you know, I learned linear perspective and chiaroscuro and all that, and making, you know, and that's why I love Rembrandt so much and all those artists. They were able to convey this convincing illusion of the 3D world. And I love that idea, but and I still try to do that in my painting. But the thing about the landscape is you have these vast spaces, right? Big open expanses. The space is so much different than in an interior, which is a challenge. And then the thing that I really love and that I find challenging is, and this is particular to where I live because there's a lot of woods there, is like trees and woods are a unique kind of space because generally in art, when you're trying to create plastic space, you're dealing with trying to make the illusion of a solid form. You know, like if it's a figure or a jar or an apple or something, you have this solid object. How do I make the flat surface look like a solid 3-dimensional thing? And then you're dealing with the illusion of empty space. How do I make the space around the thing, right? But a tree or a forest is weird because it fills up space, but it's also mostly empty, right? Like a tree it's not really a solid form because you can climb up in there and the birds are up there and there's all this open space. And so I love the challenge of trying to convey that density of form that's both solid and empty at the same time. I never get tired of that. That's why there's, you know, it looks like trees in most of my paintings, if not all of them, because that's the
well, thank you
Bravo.
so much.
Bravo.